occasionally I get sent a game to look at for this channel, and it's a okay game, but it is doing something that another game has already done and doesn't have much to differentiate it. So that kind of presents an interesting conversation in its own right, because we can look at the new game and the old game and think about, you know, what it could do differently to make itself stand apart from the other game or have something more appealing about it. The game I'm talking about in this case is RogueJack, which has been sent to me. I'm going to play it a little bit first and give you a first impression, and then talk a little bit about how this idea has already been executed in other places and whether or not that's a problem in this case. And you can probably tell from the name already what it's trying to do. We've got Blackjack, which is, you know, the card game where you have to get 21, not go over 21 or go bust, combined with some sort of roguelike mechanics. We initially get to select from a couple of different decks in this demo, and it tells us what they do, although I don't really know what that means yet because I haven't played the game. This is a really solidly designed UI. It's visually appealing, it's consistent, the typography stands out nicely. I like these sort of jaunty angled windows. It's a visually appealing game, but it is quite vanilla in the sense that there doesn't appear to be a theme here other than a sort of game showy type blackjack scenario, which makes this quite different from some of the more popular card games we've seen come out recently, like Balatro. Okay, so I've got 12. I'm going to draw on that. 6 and 6, that gives me 12, so I'm going to draw on that. Blackjack, beginner's luck, I guess. Improve your deck by purchasing new cards, upgrading them, or removing unwanted ones. So far, so roguelike. Now, this is potentially going to be where the interesting decisions in this game live. You know, my sort of instinct as someone who sort of understands the basic rules of blackjack but isn't a super hardcore blackjack player is that I'm going to want to load my deck up with cards that have a smaller value or sort of middling value, because the more 10s you add to your deck, the more chance you have of getting bust on any given round. To kind of mitigate those grey areas where I'm not sure what I should do, if I load my deck with sort of 4s, 5s and 6s, then I'm going to have a stronger deck overall. And so that would be my starting strategy at a sort of gut feel level for this game. Choose 3 cards to add to deck. So I'm going to go with the 7 based on what I just said, because it's a kind of medium sized number in the context of this game. Next battle. And it's interesting that it calls it a battle, because there isn't much about the thematics here that really gives us a sense of a battle happening. There's some crossed swords here, but that is it. And I think one thing I want to draw your attention to about this UI, like I said, the UI visually is very appealing, but one of the things about this layout that really annoys me is the player's health is represented twice. We've got it up here in the top left and down here in the bottom left, and that is like obviously not a game-breaking thing in terms of determining how many people are going to play your game, but it is a small annoyance that is going to make the game a little bit slower to learn for people, because where is the best place to look? It's better to just pick one and have that. The way aces work in blackjack, where you can play them as a 1 or a 10, is going to mean that having an ace in the pack you pull is always going to be the best option to add more aces to your deck, which I kind of don't like. I don't like it in engine building games like roguelikes or anything where you're sort of leveling up and picking from options when there is a really obviously good option, right? What you really want is for the player to have a strategy, right? Like, I'm building a burn deck, or I'm going down this route where I need these cards to synergize together, and then the best choice in the context of like which of these cards do I pick to level up is going to come from the player's strategy rather than like an inherent value of the game. And one of the problems with blackjack is it's always going to be better to have more aces in your deck, because they count as 2 different numbers and can change contextually. Well, that was lucky. A glass card, so you can see it when it's on the top of the deck. I'm going to go with that. That sounds good. We've got jokers, which work like Balatro jokers, I guess. They're like morphing modifiers for like the whole game. I don't know. I haven't bought one yet. Haven't seen how they work. Standing on the 18. I do think deck building in the context of a blackjack game is interesting, because you can stack the odds towards... Why did I draw that? you can stack the odds towards having a safer deck. The weird thing with Balatro for me was I never learned to play poker, and I know that might be weird as someone who is a professor of game design. Like I loosely understand poker, but when I was a kid, I had quite a lot of friends that had quite a lot more money than me when we were teenagers, and they got all into playing real money poker and gambling, and I used to just watch them and just think, I cannot afford to do this. So I never learnt the rules when I was at the age you would normally learn the rules of poker. Later in life, that turned out to serve me quite well because I have quite an addictive personality, and I think if I got into something like gambling, then it would be really harmful to me. You know, I've struggled with addiction to various other things and impulse control, as lots of people with ADHD do in their lives. And so Balatro, trying to play it was a very interesting experience because I don't really have a very good mental inventory of what the hands you can play in poker are. So it's interesting to see like a different situation where someone is making one of these card game roguelikes with a different card game that I do know how to play, because I think Balatro really does depend on your existing understanding of poker and interest in poker. I'm interested in what this suits value bit down here is supposed to give us. I'm not sure what that adds. In terms of the structure of this game, you can see up the top it says there are 15 enemies to play through. Maybe that's just the demo. I didn't really get a sense from that run through of how the deck is going to change over the course of the game. And I think that's really what I'm feeling for when I play anything that calls itself a roguelike. How do my decisions about upgrading change the way the game feels? I don't want to just get more powerful. I want to feel like the moment-to-moment piloting of what I'm doing changes as the deck morphs. I think one of the problems with trying to do Blackjack and Roguelike together is that turn-to-turn decisions ultimately just come down to drawing a card or not drawing a card, which means that all the kind of composition of your deck impacts in terms of what you're doing as a player is this binary decision, and I don't know if there's enough richness there to really get something like really compelling out of. I'm going to stick on that 17. There's lots of really helpful feedback for the developer already on here in the itch comments, and that's great, and that's one of the reasons why I think people should always be doing itch demos of their games before thinking about selling what they're making on Steam, because you will just nip so many problems in the bud by doing things that way. The comment right at the top here says this is just Dungeons and Degenerate Gamblers in Balatro. So the Balatro thing I can kind of see because of the visual style of this. It's hard not to associate it with Balatro because of this heavy use of turquoise as the background color. That's sort of the branding of Balatro, I suppose. You know, this does have a style that loosely indicates a theme. It's got these kind of jaunty UI boxes and this kind of funky music that kind of makes you think of a game show. The sort of shapes of the interface and the background animation are sort of very lightly evoking Memphis style, which is this sort of 80s Saved by the Bell type graphic design style that you might associate with things like MTV and Nickelodeon cartoons. But it's kind of got this game show feel, but there isn't really a theme, there isn't a fantasy here, and that does make it feel very kind of a bit like a sort of casual mobile game rather than something that I think a lot of people who play indie games would go for. And I don't think it's fair to really compare it to Balatro apart from the turquoise, because, you know, Balatro is quite psychedelic and it feels a bit edgy. You know, there's something about Balatro that kind of reminds me of Denton, the folks that made Hotline Miami. And okay, it's pixel art, it's kind of cute looking, but it has this sort of acidic psychedelic quality to it that feels a bit sort of punk, I guess. So it's sort of got a direction, and RogueJack doesn't seem to have a direction outside of it just being Blackjack and this kind of game show casino feel to the whole thing. It'd be interesting to hear other people's perspectives on that, because obviously I can only give my own subjective taste, but it's not super appealing to me. I would like it to have a bit more of a theme, a bit more of a out there creative direction in some way. And I think this is actually the point where it is quite helpful to compare it to Dungeons and Degenerate Gamblers, because that is a game that does do that. The same idea executed differently, really, and you've got this sort of fantasy setting, and I have mixed feelings about this. The pixel art in this game doesn't make sense to me. You know, I don't really associate pixel art with like high fantasy and tabletop role-playing games, and there's a lot of sort of wink wink nudge nudge gamer in jokes in this that I don't personally find appealing. You can tell it's a sort of Yogscast affiliated game because it's doing all this stuff with like Witcher references and stuff that I just find a bit The Witcher is already funny. The Witcher is already sort of satirical in various ways and has a kind of funny tone to it. And I think when things are already funny, you doing sort of pastiches or satires of them doesn't make sense. It's like doing a parody of Discworld. It's like Discworld is already a parody. I don't know. I like this game and I would probably play this again because there's a lot more going on here than there is currently in RogueJack 21. But I think the execution of the like theme in Dungeons and Degenerate Gamblers, which I can't say, which is a problem if people struggle to say the title of your game. I think the way it does upgrades and stuff is a lot more interesting. The pixel art doesn't work for me. It's beautiful pixel art, but it just sort of makes the whole game hard to read. Like, I don't want to play a card game that is using pixel art for the text and stuff like that. So it's very easy to look at a game like RogueJack and say, well, that idea has already been done. It's already been executed in this other game. But that is working on the assumption that the other game has executed it perfectly. And I personally find that, you know, generic high fantasy setting, playing blackjack in a tavern isn't the most interesting application of this idea. If I wanted to add some more interesting theme to this, I would think of like, what do people already associate with blackjack and gambling in terms of a fantasy, and then I would like push in the direction of that fantasy. So it may be that when you think of blackjack and you think of casinos, you think of like the mafia, right? So you could go in that direction. It could be that you think of like things like ancient Egypt because that's the theme that casinos have. So you could go further in that direction. But at the moment, this sort of it's just bland. If you went down the route that Dungeons and Degenerate Gamblers went, you know, not necessarily high fantasy, but just having any theme at all, then you have an easier way to sort of theme your card upgrades and stuff like that in a way that makes more innate sense, whereas a lot of this feels just quite abstract and bland. I do prefer this art style for playing a card game. There's something about trying to mix pixel art and cards together that doesn't sit well with me. I just find it like a irritating combination of things because of the visibility of stuff and I don't know, it's just mixing things that don't go for me. I would rather a high fantasy card game looked like something I would play at a table rather than something I would play at a computer. So there's some slightly confusing language here because this Joker says if it's in your hand, and it's not in my hand, it's just floating down there. So I would think about that, Dev, maybe. It's a little bit confusing to... Why did I stand on 8? It's a little bit confusing to have a card at the bottom that is sort of in your hand and not at the same time. And I know that's how Balatro does it as well, but does it talk about those jokers as being in your hand? I don't think they are. They're like on a tableau, I think is what we call that in card games, is, you know, when you've got cards in front of you that stay there, it's generally referred to as that. Nice. And now I'm gonna get healed because I won that hand with a healing heart card in. Is that going to give me any feedback? Oh, it didn't. I don't know. Hard to see some of the card effects happening as well. I think the communication of the effects of the cards when they actually happen in the game is maybe not as big as it could be. So yeah, this is what I wanted to talk about, and it's basically that the lose state in this game is disappointing. And when I say it's disappointing, what I mean is it's not disappointing enough. The wins and losses in this game need to feel more epic if it's really gonna make people feel like a strong emotion about the thing that they're trying to do, which is win the rounds and advance, and the thing that they're trying to not do, which is lose and die, which is presented as dying. We've got health, we've got battling. There's not really much else in the game to sort of prop up that metaphor of you are battling the other person. You know, even just having like a little character face that winces or something when you do them damage would really help with that side of things, but it's not there. Now, The reason I bring up losing and making losing kind of feel impactful is that is a key part of any game that is rooted in gambling. And that's true of things like blackjack and poker, but it's probably also true of roguelikes and what we like about roguelikes as well. Now, there is a book about Vegas and gambling, the design of slot machines and addiction. It's called Addiction by Design. I'm going to put a link in the description of this video to a great podcast episode on that book that sort of reviews that book and takes you through the key points. But one of the interesting things I learned from that book is that if you sort of study gamblers at places like Vegas, the thing they get addicted to isn't the idea of winning, but it's the catharsis of losing and of like basically hitting the point where they can't play anymore. That's a really interesting thing to consider if you're making a game like this that kind of uses casino stuff and gambling metaphors, is that you want the wins to feel epic, as we do in most games. We want a big fanfare when we win a round, and then we want an even bigger fanfare when we kind of complete an area or defeat a boss or whatever. You need that stuff. It's feedback for players, helps them understand what they did, helps them understand the kind of like value of what they did in the context of the game. But you also want the deaths or the failures to feel significant. And at the moment, all this game has is like a when you lose a hand, which is maybe okay because it's just losing a hand. But when you totally get KO'd in this game, it is just game interrupted. You know, that's the end of the demo. And I think that would be a really helpful place for the developer to focus here. I think the game needs more of a theme to stop it feeling like a sort of casual mobile game that your grandma would play. It does need to pick a theme. I think if you're going to go with this idea of the players are battling each other, then there needs to be a little bit more of a sense of stakes and pain, and the theme could help with that, right? If you could go really dark with this. You could go down the inscription route of like, you are playing against a character who is going to kill you if you lose the game, right? And it's like a mob boss. One of the things to think about indie games when it comes to creative direction is you need to pick a direction and go in that direction and push hard in that direction. Because if you stay in the middle, then you end up making something that just feels like a sort of commercial casual game. And if you think of all the directions you could go in, like cozy is a creative direction. It's not a game genre. Cozy is like an aesthetic thing. So you can go in a direction that is very soft and fluffy and friendly, and that is a direction. And grimdark is another direction, and sort of weird and psychedelic, that's another direction. And that's kind of like the Balatro direction to some degree. And there are all of these different directions you can go in. But I think at some point you need to be bold and you need to pick one of those. And like comparing this to Dungeons and Degenerate Gamblers like we did in this video, like I personally don't like the direction of that game. I think everything in that game is very well executed. I'm not saying it's a bad game, but the kind of, it's high fantasy and we're doing Witcher in jokes and it's also pixel art. Those things for me just feel very like low-hanging fruit, like doing something that is very easy because the largest proportion of gamers are going to be like, haha, I get that joke, I know who Geralt is. It doesn't work for me personally, but it's at least they've picked a direction and they've gone in that direction, whereas this kind of just feels like, you know, you've got some assets from a sort of casual game, card game asset pack, worked with that, and now it's like, okay, take me somewhere with this. It's cowboys, or it's the mafia, or it's ancient Egypt, or it's something. Normally I try to focus more on game mechanics on this channel because that is my background, but I did look at the feedback that the developer has already gotten on itch, and it seems like there are kind of distinct builds you can go towards, and that's great. That's a good sign in terms of the game design. But I just feel like a lot of people that, you know, buy games on Steam, identify as indie gamers, aren't going to go for this because it feels a bit too bland. I think if you're going to call your game RogueJack and have Rogue in the title, then having this sort of middle of the road, casual looking casino game show vibe to the game doesn't really make sense. Like the branding doesn't work together with the creative direction of the game. The sort of players who know what it means for a game to have Rogue in the title are also going to be the sort of players that maybe want that to indicate some sort of fantasy or some sort of danger or peril.
Thank you to the patrons. You have enabled this thing to exist. Thank you to the patrons. I put your name on this list. Thank you to the patrons. Roguelike.